Star Wars announced some upcoming books as a part of a publishing panel during New York Comic-Con a couple of days ago, and I've got some mixed thoughts, to put it lightly. As I explained in an earlier video, I don't find myself very excited for Star Wars Legacy, not because the idea of a Rey-Leia story isn't good, just because it comes off like another fill-in-the-blank Star Wars novels where we know what can be done with the characters is very limited, and thus it feels more like treading water than anything else. The second story, which I think has actually over the last few days received more attention, is Eyes Like Stars by Ashley Poston. It's described as a charming young adult romance set 1.5 years before The Force Awakens. It'll somehow include the First Order, and I bet we'll see one character join the Resistance and one character, at least temporarily, join the bad guys. Now, this is not the first Star Wars romance novel, as we'll discuss in a second, although it does have the subtitle, a Star Wars romance novel, which to me is a little bit weird, but I do think it is a recognition of how modern readers often are pushed towards specific genres and like to stay in those genres. I know many women, for example, who do read fantasy or do read romance specifically. So from that point of view, I think this is a smart choice, although it's a bit misleading to call this the first Star Wars romance novel, as I've heard some do. Lost Stars is going to get a big part of this video, so I'll come back to that in a moment. But The Princess and the Scoundrel was certainly a romance novel. The Courtship of Princess Leia, arguably also a romance novel. Even the Children of the Jedi trilogy arguably is mostly about the romance between Luke and Callista Ming, especially the second book. And just thinking about it, Dark Disciple, also, that's a Quinlan Voss Asajj Ventress romance novel for sure. I personally don't read a ton of romance. Obviously, many books have romantic elements, but there is a difference, I think. Definitionally, I think for a book to be a romance novel, it has to be relatively light and it has to have the couple find a happy ending together. Otherwise, it's a book with romantic element. But I'm also not an expert in the genre, as I've admitted. With that being said, I think now is time to talk about maybe my bit of a disappointment here, and that's not that there's a romance novel in Star Wars, but rather that if Star Wars wanted to go in this direction, that their first choice was not a re-release and continuation of Lost Stars. Lost Stars is one of my favorite Star Wars novels, which is kind of funny because, like the one mentioned today, it's also technically a young adult novel. Now, a young adult novel does not mean it's meant exclusively for young people or teenagers. Rather, it, I think, more describes the, one, yes, complexity of writing, but also, two, the focus on young characters. The young adult novels are also typically more plot-driven than, a more complex novel, but that's pretty much all Star Wars books anyway. But Lost Stars is actually quite good, partially because of that focus on youth, growing up, adolescence, and adulthood. It's a story that is very foundationally Star Wars. It's one that's popular, and it's one that I personally would like to see continued. Now, if my explanation is enough to make you want to read the book yourself, stop and either pick it up from the library or a bookstore, or grab the audiobook. The audiobook is excellent because I am going to talk some spoilers. So, Lost Stars stars two characters with very YA Star Wars names, Thane and Ciena. They're from a remote outer rim planet named Jellucon. They're born actually around the time of Leia and Luke, so 19 BBY. So obviously they're growing up in the early Imperial era. We see a lot of their perspective as the Empire starts to come to their world and sort of spread throughout the galaxy. Thane and Ciena are from very different families and really stratas within Jellucon, but eventually Romeo and Juliet style, they become fast friends. I say Romeo and Juliet, it's not until later they become romantic, but they become fast friends. They join the Imperial Academy. They're highly placed in the Academy. We spend time with them as they go through their schooling. They drift apart, they find friends, etc. Then, kind of right before the Battle of Yavin, they meet up for one last time and split. With Ciena, I'm sure I've said her name like 4 different times now, serving on a Star Destroyer, and Thane on the Death Star, though he's not there when it's destroyed. Either way, and I'm skipping many details, Thane ends up making the decision to desert the Empire. He joins the Rebel Alliance. We see how that betrays Ciena, and also how through a few chance encounters, their romance starts to blossom, and it's a very good story We also see how the galaxy changes when they return to Jellicoe. The once somewhat primitive but generally happy and prosperous planet has been turned into an imperial wasteland by the Empire. We see how Ciena herself is changed, and she continues serving with the Empire all the way up until the Battle of Jakku. And I won't spoil the ending of the novel, but I will say, while they both survive, the fate and the future of the two characters is left in limbo, which is why I think a lot of people really want to see Lost Stars 2. I certainly do, but maybe also why it precludes it from technically being a romance novel. But yeah, I'm of the opinion that Star Wars is a big tent because it does have such well-defined world building and aesthetics and rules. It really is able to accommodate other genres very well. Like, if you do want to put a romance novel in Star Wars, you've already got the organizations, the conflicts, the technology, everything ready to help make the series accessible. And I think generally as well, it's good to try to appeal to new fans because if they like a Star Wars romance novel, they may end up being interested not just the romance, but also the Star Wars part. I did want to talk about a few other examples of Star Wars going into specific literary genres. I do think this book will maybe go a bit further than some of the other cases we're discussing here, but one really good example and one that works super well is the MedStar duology. MedStar 1 is one of my favorite Star Wars books. I gave it an S in TapCaf Transmissions, and it reads a lot like a MASH book, but in Star Wars, you follow Barriss Offee and others as they try to set up a hospital during the Clone Wars. Another great example from Star Wars Legends is the Black Fleet Crisis, 3 books, which really lean more into military science fiction than Star Wars typically does. We get more details about fleet compositions and ship classes. I really don't like these novels as much as the other ones I mentioned so far in this video, but they do have their fans. The final example I'll use is another novel that I do really like, and that is I, Jedi. I, Jedi is unique in that it's written from a first-person perspective, although other novels have done the same. For example, the recent Acolyte book had Vernestra Rose portions in first-person perspective, but I, Jedi uses it to tell really a detective or noir story from the perspective of Corran Horn, and I just love that book. It is very, very unique. Finally, the obvious answer, the X-Wing series, that being the Rogue Squadron book, the Wraith Squadron books, and the others, they are written usually like cheesy fighter squadron books, and that makes them very, very consumable and a whole lot of fun. Doesn't really matter though. There's room for a lot, and we also have to really recognize that at the end of the day, not that many people read Star Wars books, so I'm always open to get more people in. Those are my takes though. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. I'm sure you'll let me know by liking the video and commenting down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.